Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus, powered by the Center Square and a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Christen Smith, Pennsylvania editor at the Center Square Newswire service. To support fine podcasts like this one, please donate. You can click the link in the show description, and you can find all of the Center Square's great podcasts at americastalking.com. You can also link to the Center Square podcast through the podcast drop-down menu at thecentersquare.com. We are recording on Thursday, January 26th, 2023. Joining me today is Anthony Hennen, our Pennsylvania reporter based in Philadelphia. Welcome back to the podcast, Anthony.
Good to talk to you, Christen. How you doing?
I'm good. I know we're going to end up saying this every week, but it's just another week in paradise, it seems. I've been putting out fires all week long. Well, more like the same fire over and over. I don't know about how it is for you over there, but in Harrisburg, it's just been one day after another of inaction, and yet it causes so much drama that it's astounding, really. But with that, we can dive right into our coverage that's been ongoing for the last couple of weeks about the inaction in the General Assembly. Democratic House Speaker Mark Rozzi officially adjourned the chamber until the end of February, which means that there's not going to be a deal on operating rules or votes to advance 3 constitutional amendments in time for the May primary. It was the final blow after one House Republican, Tom Mahaffey, who represents a district in Hershey, blocked his party's attempt to recall session and force a vote on operating rules, something Rozzi had been reticent to do until there was agreement on advancing one and only one constitutional amendment to the primary ballot. Now no one gets what they want, and nothing is happening aside from Rozzi's listening tour that heads to Philadelphia Friday. The goal, he says, is to get the public's advice on how to fix Harrisburg. I'll note that in a late Friday news dump, Rozzi released a statement saying that despite 10 years as a rank-and-file member of the House, he never understood how dysfunctional state government was until he became the unlikely speaker earlier this month. Anthony, what do you think about Rozzi's strategy here? I mean, operating rules are likely something few of us have ever really thought about, let alone develop strong opinions on. So I'm curious if you think there's even going to be turnout in Philadelphia for this. You know, what is your sense of how this is going to play there?
I think there's always going to be some level of turnout. I think at this point, these major issues, it's not like this listening tour can really turn back the clock and fix those sorts of things. I think generally, if you're a Democrat, then you're fairly happy with this strategy, with some caveats. So, generally, this is sort of running out the clock until the Democrats can regain an out-and-out majority. And so there's no sorts of compromise or issue. The margin will still be razor thin, and that will create some problems. But in general, this will put the House in more secure Democratic hands. So on that level, you have to be happy to a certain extent with it. The problem is that this is clearly, we went from a few weeks ago, these broad proclamations of bipartisanship, of goodwill, of a new era in Harrisburg, just almost comically fast, the way those petered out and were proven to be more rhetoric than anything concrete. The cost of this really is, shutting down the Senate as well, because they haven't been able to really make much progress on their end of the table. But also, this really kind of hurts drawing out again the legislative amendment process and trying to have some sort of fix to victims of sexual abuse and being able to sue, their perpetrators or the institutions that protect their perpetrators. And this is really just another insult to injury after the previous session where, an administrative flaw of not correctly announcing or putting out enough notice torpedoed it. So, this has been a years-long situation that's been a mess. And this is, again, just adding on to it once again. And I'm not really sure what the next step will look like for that. That the cost of torpedoing the other amendments, which were, clearly favored more by Republicans and Democrats. That's a legislative win on that end. But there's a heavy price to pay for that. And unfortunately, it's not politicians who have to carry that, but it's average Pennsylvanians and Pennsylvanians who, have been victimized in the past in a very horrendous way.
You're absolutely right that taxpayers and victims of childhood sexual abuse are the ones that are missing out here. Not just missing out, but losing terribly. As it is, while on the surface, the squabble, I'll say, between House Republicans and House Republicans and House Democrats is over operating rules, which for our listeners is things that are very basic, like how many members on each committee we're going to have and things like that you could tussle over and fight in a way to, maintain power, particularly for the House Republicans' newfound minority where they haven't been in years. They're probably, from my understanding, putting up quite a fight to implement some rules that would give them more leverage than Democrats had in the past. And you can look at that however you want. But at the end of the day, the real drama here unfolding, the real issue underneath this rules debate is these three constitutional amendments, chief among them, as you said, opening the statutory window for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse to sue their perpetrators in civil court. We were fortunate here at the Center Square to have a lot of conversation with Representative Jim Gregory, who is in the House Republican caucus, about this issue specifically. He's the leading voice in the House on this particular legislation and amendment. In fact, he told me earlier this week that that's the entire reason he came to Harrisburg, was to fix this problem. And that despite all of these setbacks that they've experienced over the last 5 or 6 years, including this very public betrayal by his good friend, Speaker Rozzi, he says all that hasn't dissuaded him. He will not stop until they get this window enacted. And he's still, committed to the constitutional amendment path, as I think at the end of the day, Democrats are too. It's just that they do not want to see these other two constitutional amendments for voter ID and regulatory reform on that ballot. And it doesn't matter if it's in May or November or 2024. They don't want to see it there. And they know they have a majority for the next 2 years. So their motivations to run out the clock are pretty high. And, I think in talking with some of them, you would know, or they would say that we're not running out the clock. We won a majority in November. We did. It's just because of technicalities that more Republicans are on the floor right now than Democrats, but that's not in truth. And to clarify, Representative Tony DeLuca out in Allegheny County, he died about a month before the November elections, but it was after a statutory deadline to substitute him or a new candidate in his place. So technically his seat is a Democratic seat, but he wasn't there to swear in. Plus we have special elections coming up, not just to fill his seat, but 2 others that were vacated by Democrats. So their majority is all but foretold at this point. It's, aside from a major upset, they're going to have 102 seats on February 8th when everyone wakes up. And so it's not unexpected that this is how this is shook out. For weeks, I think Rozzi was trying to bring everyone to the table, hoping that Republicans might cave to the pressure and unbundle the amendments, as Representative Gregory had asked them to do, which frankly surprised a lot of Democrats and some in his own party. But it became clear, because they would have had to act by Friday to actually get this on the ballot for the May primary, that just wasn't going to happen. So he gabbled out, they're not coming back till February 27th. And this listening tour is what Rozzi is doing in the meantime.
I think what it is, there's a lot of blame to go around. It's easy to focus on Democrats in some ways, simply because of how Rozzi has been leading as speaker. But, it's also the Republicans could have broken up those 3 amendments into 3 packages rather than one. The blame here you can see falling on both sides, depending on how you want to weigh it. That can vary. But I think this is just a reflection of Pennsylvania has its reputation on the federal level of being more pragmatic, sending legislators, Republicans and Democrats, who are both willing to break from the political line of their parties. We see this in Josh Shapiro's run-up as winning the governor's seat, of willing to break some of either from previous Governor Tom Wolf or from his party. But on the state level, that's some of that can just be rhetoric more than actual fact. And we're kind of seeing brinksmanship on both sides that did not necessarily work out in anyone's favor here.
You're right. It's definitely a blame game. And I guess it just depends on which argument you want to follow. But do you think that, given, the public input that he gets on this listening tour that people will that will actually end up in the rules, because I've never seen a situation like that. I can't imagine, and I guess we'll find out, but to be sitting there listening to them adopt rules on the floor that were potentially inspired by what the people of Pennsylvania say they want. I'm just really curious. This is a really unusual way of going about this, and I just can't imagine what that would look like going forward. I mean, it's something that I guess we'll be following. But yeah, do you think that they'll actually take to heart what we have to say, or are these going to be rules that look like many, many other years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be it's a bit of a big ask to turn to the public to have these ready to go, well thought out rules for the House floor. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I could see it as almost kind of a small advisory role, or if nothing else, looking for public cover for rulemaking they already want to do. But it's not exactly an area of government that's extraordinarily sexy or really grabs the attention of the public. So I find it hard for the listening tour to really, have something new that comes from the grassroots, from the general public. But maybe we'll be surprised. Maybe we'll see.
Yeah, we'll have to definitely keep an eye out. And even though the House and now the Senate are at a standstill, doesn't mean the rest of the government is not working. You covered a really great story this week. Our Auditor General released a report that showed 12 different school districts across Pennsylvania have been, and tell me if I'm characterizing this wrong, but hoarding money essentially in order to raise taxes. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that report said?
Yeah, so this was broken out, was that yesterday, Wednesday, the 25th, during a press conference called by the state auditor, which generally doesn't happen. I mean, the last year where I've been covering Pennsylvania, I think he's called a press conference maybe 2-3 times. So it's relatively rare. But essentially, Auditor General Timothy DeFore came up and essentially gave the results of some audits that they were doing over the past year, basically looking at a dozen school districts from 2018 to 2021. Essentially, these districts, which are urban, rural, suburban, all across geographically, these districts have been engaged in essentially moving money around to take advantage of a legal loophole where they could raise taxes without that tax being put to a referendum up to a vote for taxpayers. So essentially, what the audit found was that school districts, even though they had funds in their general fund reserve, where they could pay for various spending needs and all that sort of thing, they would temporarily move them to the capital funds as a way to show that they needed greater tax revenue to cover costs, and essentially using a loophole where the Department of Education would grant them a referendum exception, so they wouldn't have to turn to the public to ask to approve the tax increase. They could just increase these taxes, boost revenues, and then still have these extra reserves. So collectively, over 4 years, these dozen school districts did this 37 times. And as Auditor DeFore said, though they increased taxes, the districts have $390 million in their general funds accounts that is sitting unspent. So basically, this was a legal thing to do, but the law that allowed it they meant this to be used as an extreme measure for financial hardship. In a situation where the school's finances are extraordinarily tight, something happened. It just going to the public and working this through could present some problems. But rather than this being an extreme measure to be used only in specific circumstances, the school districts have used it as a regular budgeting tool. DeFore described it as basically a shell game, and these districts finding a way to use the law to their advantage so they could always raise taxes without taxpayers being able to say no or to get a say on this. And this is only a dozen districts. Pennsylvania has 500 districts. So DeFore said it's not a stretch to say that's happening throughout the Commonwealth. There's probably other instances of this. This seems to be a big issue here. This is not just keeping pandemic money, held back for a rainy day or some other reason. This has been a practice before the pandemic hit, and a long-running one at that. So some of this, to be fair, it seems like a bit of this was pragmatic, simply because school boards would need to submit a budget by June 30th, but that was also the deadline for a state budget. So essentially, schools did not know how much money they were receiving from the state, which I believe is about, I think, a third of their total revenue, if I'm remembering correctly. They get a little bit of money from federal sources, maybe 10%, but mostly it's coming from local taxpayers. So, if you're submitting a budget and you're not quite sure how much exactly you're receiving from the state, you can see how this could create some problems, that districts might prefer to raise taxes a bit rather than risk going into a deficit, something like this. But, if that's the case, DeFore suggested, we could move the fiscal year from June 30th for school districts to September 30th, because then they have a couple months where they know how much money they're receiving. They can adjust. This wouldn't be a problem. But also, the audit was recommending that the General Assembly, look at this, change the law to make sure this loophole can't be exploited in this way. Because it's a case of local citizens paying higher taxes, but it's not an emergency. There's still hundreds of millions in the bank collectively. This seems to be an easy way to raise taxes without having to necessarily fight or justify it, which is a shame for transparency's sake, and just for the sake of people on fixed incomes, people trying to make their own budgets. This is an extra burden for them.
Nothing fires up people in Pennsylvania more than their property taxes, which, as you mentioned before, they vary wildly no matter where you live. And so I find that the schools, or at least the Auditor General's description of what the schools are saying, is that, well, sometimes we do this because we don't know exactly what we're getting from the state. I'd like to know more about that, simply because they are correct in that the state always goes right up onto the June 30th deadline to pass their budget, and education funding is usually one of the biggest debates and arguments they have. It's not something that is set in stone and agreed to until the very final hour. And so I can understand from that perspective that school districts are nervous. They don't know what's going to happen. However, especially between the years that he's looking at, 2018 to 2021, with the exception of last year, there wasn't a ton. Well, last year there was a bit of a delay into the first or second week of July. And then there was the pandemic years, and those budgets were passed. And in 2020, I believe they had a budget by May, and then again by December. Those are some interesting years to study as far as this go. And so I wonder if that means that the problem will look worse once we get back to studying normal years. Will it get better because we don't have this weird influx of and outflux of money? And I suppose stimulus funding is going to make that even more challenging, because schools got billions of dollars in stimulus funding, and they were warned not to use it for one-time or for recurring expenses. We don't know what we don't know yet. It's too early to tell what financial shape a lot of school districts will be in. But this sort of report is, I wonder if it's a canary in the coal mine. Did the Auditor General say he was going to release more detailed information soon?
Yes, I believe actually today, just an hour or so ago, the audit was released publicly, so we'll have some more details to look through of those dozen districts. As far as looking at statewide or other districts who have struggled with financial issues in the past, there's not data or information out on that. But I think these 12 districts being used as kind of case studies for the rest of the state. I think this will lead to more in the future, and we'll get a little better breakdown of just how much these tax increases were as opposed to how much they had in the bank. I think this is not a one-off issue that's going to go away. I think this is more the start rather than the completion of anything.
Have you heard any reaction in the last 24 hours since this came out? Because this was just big news as of Wednesday, and I'm sure there are some educational organizations out there that have something to say. Have you seen anything, or is it still percolating out there and people trying to digest what they've heard?
Yeah, I think some of it is more just people trying to understand it at first, and especially now because the details weren't released until today. There wasn't as much to go off aside from the press conference and the press release. Brian Cutler, Representative Cutler, said he would dig into, give this a look and see what the General Assembly can do. One of the education associations whose name escapes me put out at least a defense of this, not necessarily in general in particular, but basically saying this is not as bad as it might look. But I think it's still going to take a few more days for everything to roll out until people have a better sense of what this means specifically or what this means for their local district.
Interesting. Yeah, accounting gimmicks as they work are something that are used all the time by school districts, by the state even. So, and if you can look at it and think that they're up to no good, but sometimes it is just a strategy that they use to get from one year to the next. So I'd be really interested to see how that story develops over the next coming months. I'm sure that lawmakers will not be letting it go. The issue of money kept in reserves by school districts is one that's been ongoing for years. Particularly House Republicans have drawn a lot of attention to it as we continue to raise state funding for school districts every single year. As you mentioned before, about 10% comes from federal sources, the vast majority, upwards of 60% comes from property taxes, local property taxes, and then the state kind of fills in the gap. And that can lead to a really unfair system where people are paying a lot more and sometimes not getting the same level of education that they were in a nearby district where property values have different values and there's different income levels. It's a mess. Pennsylvania's been trying to figure out a better way to fund their educational system for decades and to get rid of property taxes. So this is all part of a much larger conversation around school funding. Are we getting, the best bang for our buck? Is there a better way we can do this? And it's an interesting conversation that will continue on, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about. That's about all the time we have for this week. Thanks again to Anthony for joining me. We encourage you to find news that matters for taxpayers of Pennsylvania at thecentersquare.com. To support fine podcasts like this one, please donate. You can click the link in the show description. This has been the Pennsylvania in Focus podcast, part of the America's Talking Network. Find all of the Center Square's podcasts at americastalking.com. I'm Christen Smith, and I'll be back next week with Anthony Hennen to discuss the biggest stories affecting you, the taxpayers.